Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, checking out this new album from John Fogerty, Legacy, the CCR Years. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So John Fogerty, who just turned 80 back in May, just released his 11th studio album on August 22nd. Of course, John was one of the founding members of Creedence Clearwater Revival back in 1959, along with his brother Tom and Doug Clifford and Stu Cook while they were still in high school. That was back when the band was called the Blue Velvets. When the band signed to Fantasy Records in 1964 to release their first single, Fantasy Records wasn't a big fan of the name of the band, so they recommended the band change their name to the Gollywogs. The band went along with it just to be able to release their music, and it was around this time that John took over as the primary songwriter and lead singer for the band. And then in 1967, Fantasy Records was sold, and the new owner of the label gave the band the opportunity to change their name because they knew the band was not fond of the name the Gollywogs. They hated that name since it was forced upon them, so they ended up going with Creedence Clearwater Revival. And then in 1968, their career just absolutely took off. They would go on to release 7 iconic albums in a very short period of time, from 1968 until 1972. And even though they had an insane amount of success over that short period of time, of course the band wasn't without disagreement, much of which I think came from resentment from the other 3 members of the band because of how much control that John had over the band's direction. And then after recording Pendulum in 1970, Tom would leave the band and would leave CCR as a 3-piece band for their first time ever. Pendulum would also be the last album solely produced by John Fogerty. Needless to say, from the founding of the band until Pendulum, John Fogerty had a big say in the musical direction and the sound of the band. And then CCR would release their last album, Mardi Gras, in the spring of 1972, and it was a very different kind of album. First off, it didn't have Tom, so musically it was a little bit different. It was also co-produced by Doug Clifford and Stu Cook, and I think out of all their albums, it was probably the least cohesive album from the band. So after leaving CCR, John would go on to have a very successful solo career, and for the longest time he would refuse to play any of CCR's songs live because he didn't want to pay any kind of performance royalties to Fantasy Records, who of course still owned all the rights to CCR's songs. And actually David Geffen had to pay $1 million just to get John out of his contract with Fantasy Records because he still owed Fantasy 8 more albums. And then in 1985, John would release his most successful solo album, Centerfield. And this is where things get a little crazy because the very first single off that album, The Old Man Down the Road, sparked a lawsuit from Fantasy Records because they said that John Fogerty plagiarized an older song from CCR. And what Fantasy Records claimed in that lawsuit is that John had blatantly rewritten Run Through the Jungle, which is a hit single from CCR from 1970, and recrafted that into this new song on his new album. Yes, John Fogerty was sued for plagiarizing John Fogerty. John would ultimately end up winning that lawsuit, but there was also a defamation lawsuit from the head of Fantasy Records towards John that they would end up settling, and John would have to change the lyrics to 2 songs on that album. And since the end of the lawsuits in the late 80s, John slowly started beginning to play more and more CCR songs live, but not having the rights to his music haunted him for years. John has been very vocal about the way his music has been used and sold by Fantasy Records over the years, including a very famous Blue Jeans ad with the song Fortunate Son, which I've long considered probably the greatest protest song in American music history. How much John hated that song being used in that commercial. Finally, the commercial was pulled down by the company. But finally, after a 50-plus year long battle to regain his music, finally in 2023, John was able to buy back his rights. So that brings us to 2025 and the album that I'm talking about today. This record is more than just a collection of re-recorded songs. It's a celebration and reclamation of music that made John Fogerty a legend. John revisits some of CCR's most iconic and recognizable songs on this album, blending the energy of the originals with the wisdom of a lifetime in music. And with this album, I don't think John is just simply looking back on his career. I think he's putting his stamp on these songs for future generations. It's a reminder how timeless CCR's music remains today, and how central John Fogerty's voice and guitar are to the sound of American rock music. So for this new album, John Fogerty was inspired by Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift had gone through this many-year-long battle to regain control of her music. She'd gone through almost every one of her albums, re-recording her music. I think what really made those re-recorded albums so great compared to so many other ones that have tried to do this is that she was able to recapture a vast majority of the sound off those original albums. You could go do A-B comparisons with those re-recordings and the original ones. There wasn't a big difference between the two albums. And of course, she's not the first artist to ever try to do that. I think she's probably easily the most successful at it, though. There's lots of other ones that have tried, but I would say a vast majority of them have all failed. They're good compared to the originals, where you could take her albums and they're almost carbon copy reprints of the originals. And in some cases, I think some of the stuff she did on those re-recorded albums are actually a little bit better than the originals. So even though John owns the rights to the CCR music and the CCR legacy, he wanted to go through this project, almost as a way to celebrate the history of CCR and the incredible music that they made over a really short period of time in their career. He does cover a lot of music on this album. There's 20 songs. I think it's right around an hour long. Generally on these album reviews, I go down through like a track-by-track review, but there's too many tracks to do this on. I picked some of my favorite ones to go over, though. And because these re-recorded albums are generally, I'd say, way more miss than hit, I didn't really have really high expectations going into this. But like always, when I do an album review, I always go into it with an open mind. I knew this was going to be a hard album to review just because I love so many of these great CCR tracks. I grew up listening to CCR, so going through an album like this, I was always going to immediately pick up on the smallest differences. And for a lot of the tracks I did review for this one, I did end up going back and doing A-B comparisons with the originals. So Up Around the Bend starts the album off, and I think out of all the tracks on this album, all the re-recorded tracks he did on this one is probably one of the more noticeably different from the originals. I think it's primarily due to the chorus. The way he sings the chorus is just very different than the original. I think without those differences in the chorus, it would have been a very similar sounding song. And because of how recognizable this song is, it's one of the biggest songs from CCR. I think somebody that isn't even a huge fan of the band is going to notice it right away. Even not knowing that this is a re-recorded song, they're immediately going to pick up on something being off. I did end up doing a A-B comparison on this one, and I do prefer the original one over this re-recorded version. But Who'll Stop the Rain, I think, is kind of a complete opposite from that first track. It sounds almost like a complete carbon copy of the original song. Sure, there are some subtle differences across the song, mostly which I think are the harmonizing of the vocals, which obviously, you're working with completely different musicians on this album than the original, so the harmonies are always going to be a little different. And that's really kind of the case across the entire album. And out of all 20 of the tracks on this album, I think this is probably one of the strongest ones on here. Proud Mary is another one of those tracks I think is a little more noticeably different from the original. It still does sound really good, but it's almost a little more laid back than the original one. John adds a little bit more of this almost like soulful richness to his vocals, and the slightly different style of vocals give it a little bit of different feel across the song. But it adds this almost like lived in warmth and maturity of the song that it didn't have originally. And even though I still love the original version of the song, I think this new re-recorded version is equally as good, even though there are some differences between the two. Have You Ever Seen the Rain has long been one of my favorite songs from CCR, and when it was first recorded, there was almost like this innocence to the song. But with this re-recorded version, there's a little more frailty to John's vocals, which gives the song a little more age, a little more wisdom, which I think adds a different element to the song overall. It's not as glossy as the original, and I wonder if John struggled singing the vocals on this one, just because he does kind of change the vocal structure of the chorus. It's still pretty close to the original. I'd say probably around 90% of the original song is still there. This one is one I'm kind of on the fence about. I can see where some of the differences give it a little more of a powerful presentation. It's another one of those songs with such a noticeable difference in the chorus. It does kind of change it up a little too much, I think. Looking Out My Back Door is another song that is almost identical to the original version. I listened to this new version of the original back to back, and to be honest, going through it a couple of different times, I couldn't really pick out more than just a couple of different, subtle little differences here or there. And it was all buried deep in the music. And I think mainly the reason this song sounds so similar to the original is because vocally there really aren't any higher parts to the song. So there weren't any vocal arrangements that had to be altered in any way. Plus, it's a really short song. It's only about 2.5 minutes long. It's another song where I think only the biggest CCR fans are going to be able to find anything different between it and the original. The song Born on the Bayou has a little more of a heavier low end to the song, which I don't think really changes it in any meaningful kind of way. Just one of those things I picked up on the first time I listened to it. It was and still is one of the band's grittier songs, and it's great to see that newer production styles didn't change that in any way. I will say that John's deeper vocal style on this song is noticeable, but I think the maturity in his vocals adds just another element to the greatness of the song. Run Through the Jungle has long been one of CCR's darkest songs. But originally, the song was fueled by the growing gun culture here in the US in the 60s. And it's another song that's pretty close to the original. There are some differences. Even though they are pretty slight, you will notice them, I think. The guitar has a little more of a thicker, almost atmospheric kind of sound to it. And John's vocals are a little rougher on this song than the original, which of course makes sense because he's recording it, 50 years later. But those differences give the song a little more of a different kind of uneasy kind of feeling, which I do think kind of adds to the song. Long As I Can See the Light might be the best song on this album. And it's entirely possible it's because it's a CCR song I haven't listened to a whole lot over the years, but I do love the soulful feel to this song. There's a little bit of a tremble in John's voice. It doesn't quite have the same power as the original, but the quality is still there. And this is a song that I think is a perfect example of what became the backbone of CCR's music. Yes, they're known for all those big hits they had across their career, but songs like this, the smaller songs, the B-sides, the non-album hits, that really became the bulk of their career, and there's so many great hidden tracks in there. Down the Corner is easily one of CCR's most recognizable tracks, and I think because of that, it was always going to be a difficult song to re-record. The original is playful and fun, and this new version, I can't really put my finger on it, but it's just kind of missing something. It's good, but just not as great. The groove is a little bit more laid back. It's not as bouncy as the original. It's one I definitely have to revisit a couple more times, because like I said, I just can't put my finger on what the big difference is between it and the original. Bad Moon Rising is another one of those songs from CCR that I've grown up listening to. I mean, I've heard the song hundreds, if not literally thousands of times over the years. The guitar on this new version is pretty close to the original, but it has a little more of a brighter sound to it, which I think makes this song feel a little too upbeat. It doesn't quite match the flow of the original version. But I think what works really well in this song is the age in John Fogerty's vocals. It gives the song a little more of this like doom and gloom kind of style. Traveling Band is this Little Richard inspired rock and roll chaos kind of song, and this re-recorded version matches a lot of the energy of the original version. The production on this new one though is a little more slick, a little more modern sounding than the original, and it's really the only song on this album that I had that feeling with. And at 80, John just doesn't have the ability to belt out some of these vocals like this anymore. But I think he does as good of a job as can be expected. The original version of Green River was swamp rock perfection with this jangly guitar, its southern flavored imagery, but this new version has a little more of a rootsy kind of flair to it. It doesn't have as much swing to the song. The drums are a little deeper, a little heavier in it though. Overall, I think it's as close to the original as we could have gotten. It's another one of those songs that I think is, as well known as it is. I think it was going to be another hard track to re-record. And I think, out of all the tracks on this album, this is another one I put up there at the top as one of the better ones that are done. And then that brings me down to the last track on this review, which is the last track on the album, Fortunate Son, which has long been one of my favorite songs from CCR. It's one song that I was really looking forward to checking out on this new version. Out of this entire album, is probably my most anticipated track. And at the end of listening to it, I've listened to this song a couple of times now, I think it's probably the most disappointing track on this album. And it's one that's probably the furthest away from the original version. I get it, John can't sing the same as he did, 50 plus years ago. He just doesn't have that vocal range there anymore. But I was still expecting a closer version than what we got. Musically, the song still hits, but vocally, it's just not there. And I know it's a song that he had to put on this album. People would have been upset had it not been on there. But I think after listening to the song, it probably should have been left off. Maybe that's just me because of how well I know the song. Like I said, it's my favorite song from the band. I've listened to this one probably, as much, if not more, than any other CCR song over the years. So I probably know it better than any other song from the band. But, this just isn't it. Musically, it's almost a spot-on replica of the original. Yes, like I said, there are some subtle differences here or there, some of which I think do add to the songs. And vocally, yeah, there's a lot of years on John's voice at this point. But I think he still does a pretty darn good job on these songs. Yes, he's never going to be able to hit some of those higher notes that he did 50 plus years ago, but I think he's spot on most of these tracks. There are noticeable differences on a lot of these tracks, but unless you're somebody that's memorized every lyric and every note of every CCR song, I don't think most people are going to notice. I think the quality of this album is a telling sign of how classic these songs are. They can be recorded, 50 plus years later and not sound dated and still hold the weight that they did, all those decades ago. And other than a couple of spots here or there, I think John's been able to retain a lot of his vocal range, something that a lot of his contemporaries have lost, years ago. Overall, I have to give John a lot of credit for the quality of this album. Yes, Fortunate Son does knock this album down a lot for me. On a scale of 1 to 10, I think it's a solid 7.5, I think. So as part of my album reviews, I always talk about whether or not I would own a physical copy of this album. As somebody that's grown up a big CCR fan, I already have their greatest hits on vinyl. I already have a couple of their albums on vinyl also. But this is one of those albums I probably will end up grabbing a copy of this on vinyl. It's not super expensive. It's a 2 LP release. I want to say last time I looked on Amazon, it was like under $30. So I probably will end up grabbing a copy of it. But it's something I don't absolutely have to have because, like I said, I already have a lot of these songs on vinyl. Like I said, these versions compared to the originals, they are that close. So when it comes to re-recorded albums, I would definitely put this up near the top. It's not as good as what Taylor's versions are, but John's version is just almost as good. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this new album from John Fogerty. Have you listened to it yet? Have you picked up a copy of it? What would you rate it from 1 to 10? Like I said, going into this project, I was not expecting to like it as much as I did. I was fully expecting this to be like a 3 out of 10 kind of album, especially with John being 80 years old. So I was definitely surprised to like the album as much as I did. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.